I never thought one summer could change everything in my life. I was just an ordinary girl, living in a small town where nothing extraordinary ever happened. My name is Sarah, and for most of my life, I believed I knew exactly how my story would go. I'd finish college, find a stable job, maybe marry someone kind and live a peaceful life. But that summer, the one I'm about to tell you about, completely rewrote everything I thought I knew about myself and the world. It started quietly, like every other day. The morning sun filtered through the old curtains of my room, painting the walls with a soft golden hue. I remember waking up to the sound of birds chirping outside, feeling that same calm I always did. But something about that day felt different, a little heavier, as if the air itself was carrying a secret. Maybe it was my intuition, or maybe I'm just realizing it now looking back. At breakfast, Mom was unusually quiet. She kept stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, and I could tell she was thinking about something serious. Dad had already left for work, and the house felt emptier than usual. I asked her if everything was okay, and she smiled, but it wasn't her usual warm smile. It was one of those smiles that try to hide sadness, the kind that breaks your heart even more when you notice it. "Everything's fine, honey," she said. But her eyes told a different story. I wanted to ask more, to push her to tell me what was wrong, but I didn't. I just nodded and went on with my day. Sometimes, silence feels safer than the truth. That afternoon, I decided to visit the lake behind our neighborhood. It was my favorite place since childhood. I used to go there whenever I needed to think, to breathe, or just to be alone. The reflection of the sky on the still water always made me feel like the world was pausing just for me. But when I reached the lake that day, someone was already there, sitting on the old wooden dock. He was a stranger, or at least I thought so. Tall, with dark hair and a quiet kind of presence. He didn't notice me at first. He was throwing small pebbles into the water, watching them sink slowly. Something about him made me stop walking. There was this calm around him, but also a heaviness, the kind you can feel even from a distance. After a few minutes, he turned and saw me. Our eyes met for a brief second, and I almost turned away. But he smiled, a gentle, almost hesitant smile. I smiled back, out of politeness more than anything. Then he said, "You come here often?" And I couldn't help but laugh a little. It was such a cliché line, but somehow it didn't sound awkward coming from him. I told him, "Yeah, it's my favorite place." He nodded, looking back at the lake. "It's peaceful here," he said. "I used to come here a long time ago, before I left town." That caught my attention. Before he left town, meaning he was from here. But I didn't recognize him. And our town was small enough that everyone knew everyone. I asked his name. "Daniel," he said, "Daniel Harper." The moment he said his last name, I froze for a second. I remembered that name, vaguely, from when I was a kid. There was a family named Harper who used to live near the old mill. But one night, they just disappeared, moved away without saying goodbye. And now here he was years later, sitting by the same lake like nothing ever happened. We started talking, slowly at first, like strangers testing the waters. But within minutes, it felt surprisingly easy to talk to him. He told me he'd moved back recently, after years of living in another state. He didn't say much about why he came back, just that sometimes life takes you back where it all began. Something in his tone told me there was more to that story, but I didn't ask. The sun began to set, turning the lake orange and gold. And I remember thinking how strange it was that I didn't want to leave. It had been so long since I'd felt that kind of quiet connection with someone. Before I left, he said, "Maybe I'll see you here again." And I just smiled, not realizing that from that moment, my entire life was about to change. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about him. His calm voice, the way he looked at the water like it held answers no one else could see. There was something about Daniel that felt both comforting and mysterious. I told myself it was just curiosity, that I'd forget him by morning. But I didn't. The next few days, I found myself going back to the lake again and again. Each time he was there, as if he knew I'd come. Sometimes we talked for hours, sometimes we just sat in silence. He told me small things about his life. How he used to write music, how he loved rainy days, how he'd lost touch with people he once cared about. But there was always something missing in his words, like he was leaving out the most important part. One evening, while the wind rippled through the water, he asked me, "Do you ever feel like you're living a life that doesn't belong to you?" I looked at him, not sure how to answer. He continued, "Like you're following a path someone else drew. And no matter what you do, you can't step off it." His words hit me harder than I expected, because deep down, that was exactly how I'd been feeling. I told him, "Yes, sometimes," and for a moment we just sat there. Neither of us said anything more. But it felt like he understood parts of me I hadn't even said out loud. It was both comforting and terrifying. Because when someone sees you that clearly, you can't hide anymore. As the days turned into weeks, our meetings became the most important part of my routine. It wasn't planned, but somehow, every evening, we both ended up at the lake. And every time, I learned something new about him, about myself, about how fragile peace can be. But then one day he didn't show up. I waited for hours, sitting on the same wooden dock, watching the reflection of the sky darken into night. He didn't come. The next day, I went again, and again he wasn't there. A strange anxiety began to build inside me. I didn't even know where he lived, I realized. He had always avoided talking about his current life. And now, I was sitting by that lake, wondering if I'd imagined him entirely. That night, I dreamt of the lake. Only it wasn't calm anymore. The water was dark, stormy, restless. I saw Daniel standing on the dock calling my name, but when I tried to reach him, he faded into the mist. I woke up trembling, my heart pounding. Something didn't feel right. The next morning, I went to the town library. I don't know what I was looking for exactly. Maybe some record, some clue about his family. And that's when I found it, an old newspaper clipping from 10 years ago. It said, "Local family tragedy. Harper family found dead in mysterious accident near lake." My blood turned cold. It couldn't be the same family, could it? But the names matched. Daniel Harper, age 17 at the time. The article said he died along with his parents. I stared at the paper for what felt like forever. My hands shaking, my mind refusing to believe what I was reading. I left the library in a daze. The streets felt quieter than ever. When I reached the lake that evening, the air felt heavier, colder. I sat on the dock, waiting again, though I didn't know for what. Then I heard it, a voice behind me, soft but unmistakable. "Sarah." I turned, and there he was, standing exactly where he always did, looking the same. Only this time, there was no reflection of him in the water. And that's when I realized the truth I had been too afraid to see. Daniel wasn't alive. And I had been talking to someone who no longer belonged to this world. When I realized Daniel wasn't alive, it felt like the ground beneath me disappeared. My breath caught in my chest, and I remember clutching the edge of the wooden dock, just to stop myself from falling. The air around me felt colder, heavier, like the world itself had stopped breathing for a moment. He stood there, watching me with that same calm expression, his eyes soft, almost sad. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream. But something inside me whispered not to. "Daniel." I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. He smiled faintly. "You weren't supposed to find out like this," he said. His voice sounded the same, gentle and real, yet somehow distant, like it was coming from far away. I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. "How can you be here?" I whispered. You're supposed to be dead." He lowered his eyes, the water rippling faintly behind him. "I know," he said, "but I never really left." For a moment, I thought I was losing my mind. Maybe I'd been too lonely, maybe I imagined him from the start. But the more I looked at him, the more real he felt. Every detail, every expression, every sound of his voice. It was all too clear, too alive. And yet, that newspaper clipping wouldn't leave my mind. I asked him what happened. He was quiet for a long time before answering. "That night," he said softly, "we were driving home from the lake, my parents and I. It was raining hard, the road was slippery, and something ran across the road. I swerved and then—" His voice trailed off, and I felt tears sting my eyes even before he said it. "The car went off the bridge," he whispered. "They didn't make it out." I felt a lump in my throat. "And you?" I asked. He looked at me, his eyes full of something that looked like pain and guilt. "I did," he said, for a while. He turned away, looking at the water again. I tried to move on, but the guilt never let me, he said. It kept pulling me back here, to this place. His voice broke slightly, and I realized this wasn't a ghost trying to haunt anyone. It was a soul trapped between regret and peace. And somehow, I had walked right into his unfinished story. The following days felt like a dream, or maybe a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I kept going back to the lake, even though every part of me said I shouldn't. Daniel would be there, waiting like always. But now the air around him felt different, colder. The way he looked at me wasn't the same anymore. There was distance in his eyes, as if he knew his time was running out. He told me that he couldn't leave, that something was binding him here, keeping him from moving on. I asked him if it was the lake, the accident, or his guilt. He just said, "It's all connected." And then after a pause he added, "Maybe you're the one who's meant to set me free." Those words stayed with me. They echoed in my head every night. I didn't understand what he meant. How could I possibly help a spirit find peace? I wasn't brave. I wasn't strong. I was just an ordinary woman. But somehow, the thought of helping him felt right. Like this was something I was meant to do. One evening, as the sky turned gray and the first drops of rain began to fall, Daniel told me he wanted to show me something. "Follow me," he said, walking toward the old path that led deeper into the woods. I hesitated, but his voice was calm, reassuring. I followed him, my heart pounding, my steps slow and uncertain. The woods were quiet except for the soft sound of rain hitting the leaves. After a few minutes, we reached a small clearing. In the center stood the remains of an old car, rusted and broken, half buried in the ground. "This is where it happened," he said quietly. I stared at the wreckage, my throat tightening. It was barely recognizable, but something about it felt sacred, frozen in time. He stood beside it, his expression unreadable. "I've come here so many times," he said. "But every time I do, it feels like the night never ends." I took a deep breath, stepping closer. "Maybe it's time for you to let it end," I said softly. He turned to me, his eyes full of something like gratitude and fear all at once. "I don't know how," he whispered. In that moment, I realized what he needed. It wasn't forgiveness from the world, it was forgiveness from himself. He had been punishing himself for years, trapped in a loop of guilt and pain. I reached out instinctively, even though I wasn't sure if my hand would touch him or pass right through. But when my fingers brushed against his, I felt a faint warmth. It was real, fragile but real. "Daniel," I said, my voice trembling. "You didn't mean for it to happen, it was an accident." Tears filled his eyes, glistening even though no light touched them. "I should have saved them," he said, his voice breaking. "You tried," I said. "And that's all anyone could have done." For a moment, everything was still. The rain had stopped, the air grew quiet. Then a soft light began to surround him, faint but growing. He looked at me with a peaceful kind of smile, the first I had seen on his face. "Thank you," he whispered. And then, just like that, he was gone. The light faded, and I was left standing there, alone in the clearing. But it didn't feel empty anymore. The heaviness in the air had lifted, replaced by a strange sense of calm. I knew then that he had finally found peace. For days after that night, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Everywhere I went, I felt his presence. Not haunting, but gentle, like a memory that refused to fade. Mom noticed the change in me too. "You seem different lately," she said one morning, quieter but happier. I smiled, not sure how to explain. Sometimes peace doesn't come from forgetting, it comes from understanding. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal. But I kept going back to the lake. It didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt alive, calm, beautiful. And every time the wind rippled across the surface of the water, I imagined Daniel smiling somewhere beyond it. Then one evening, I noticed something strange. On the edge of the dock, carved into the old wood, were the words, "Thank you, Sarah." I ran my fingers over the letters, tears filling my eyes. I didn't know when or how it appeared. But somehow, I knew it was his way of saying goodbye. That night, I sat by the lake for hours, the moonlight shimmering across the water. And for the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. It wasn't just Daniel who had been trapped. It was me too, trapped in a life I didn't fully understand, His story had taught me something I'd never forget. That sometimes, letting go of the past is the only way to move forward. Months passed, the seasons changed, and life continued. But every time I saw the sunset reflect on the lake, I felt a quiet reminder of him. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was gratitude. Because meeting Daniel, even in the strangest way imaginable, had changed me forever. And maybe that's what life is really about. The moments and people that cross your path. Even the ones who aren't meant to stay. They leave pieces of themselves behind. And in doing so, they help you find the parts of yourself you never knew were missing. I still visit the lake sometimes. Not out of longing, but out of love. To remember that summer, that connection. That story that began quietly and ended beautifully. And every time I sit there, listening to the gentle sound of water, I whisper softly, "Rest now, Daniel." Because even though he's gone, his story will always live within me. And I'll always be the girl who met a boy by the lake, who taught her that even ghosts can teach the living how to heal. After Daniel disappeared that night, I thought his story had ended. I believed he had finally found peace, and I could finally move on too. But life, as I've learned, rarely closes its doors that easily. Sometimes the past lingers quietly, waiting for the right moment to whisper again. The days after his goodbye felt strangely light. I woke up without that constant heaviness in my chest. For the first time in years, I could breathe fully. I went back to work, met friends, and even started sketching again, something I hadn't done since college. It was as if my soul had been washed clean by that encounter. But then little by little, small things began to happen, things that didn't make sense. It started with my phone. I'd leave it charging at night, and when I'd wake up, there would be music playing. Not random songs, but the kind Daniel once told me he used to write. Soft piano pieces, haunting but beautiful. At first, I thought I must have accidentally downloaded them. But when I checked, the files didn't exist anywhere on my phone. Then one evening, while organizing my sketchbook, I found something new inside. A page I hadn't drawn. It was a detailed sketch of the lake, the dock, and a figure standing at the edge. Daniel. The lines were faint, almost ghostly, like they'd been drawn by a hand that wasn't mine. I stared at it for a long time. Part of me was scared, but another part of me felt comforted. It was as if he was still there, watching quietly, reminding me that stories don't end just because people do. I told myself I was imagining things, that grief and memory could play tricks on the mind. But one night as I was about to sleep, I heard someone softly whisper my name. It wasn't loud, it wasn't frightening, it was gentle, like someone saying goodbye for the second time. I sat up immediately, my heart pounding. The room was empty, the air still. But on my nightstand, where there had been nothing before, lay a small silver music box. It was old, delicate, and beautifully carved. I picked it up, my hands trembling. When I opened it, a soft tune began to play, the same melody Daniel once hummed by the lake. My eyes filled with tears. It wasn't fear that I felt, it was something deeper. A realization that maybe his goodbye wasn't the end. Maybe it was a beginning I didn't yet understand. Over the next few weeks, the dreams started. They weren't like normal dreams, they felt real. Too real. I would find myself standing by the lake again. The air cool, the moonlight shimmering across the surface. And sometimes I'd see Daniel in the distance, not sad or trapped anymore, just standing there, smiling. He never spoke, he just looked at me, as if to remind me that he was still watching over me. One night, though, the dream was different. In it, the lake wasn't calm, it was restless, the waves crashing violently against the dock. I heard a voice, not Daniel's this time, a woman's voice crying for help. I woke up sweating, my heart racing. Something about that dream felt wrong, like it wasn't just a dream, but a warning. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything. I kept thinking about that woman's voice, those desperate cries. After work, I drove straight to the lake. It was quiet, peaceful, the sunset painting the water gold. But as I walked closer to the edge, I saw something half buried near the dock. A small silver bracelet, glinting faintly in the light. I picked it up, my breath catching in my throat. It had a name engraved inside, Clara. I didn't know any Clara, and I'd never seen this bracelet before. I looked around, but the place was empty. Still, That uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. I pocketed the bracelet and went home. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The sound of waves echoed in my mind, over and over, like the lake was trying to speak. The next morning, I decided to go to the town archives again. I needed to know if something else had ever happened near the lake. The librarian, an older man who had lived in town all his life, looked at me curiously when I asked. He disappeared into the back room for a few minutes, and came out holding a dusty file. "This lake's seen more than one tragedy," he said quietly, handing it to me. When I opened it, I froze. Inside were old newspaper clippings, one from 2 years after Daniel's accident. It read, "Local girl missing near lake, last seen at dusk, no traces found." Her name was Clara Adams, 21 years old. The report said she used to go jogging by the lake every evening, until one night, she never returned. The police had searched for weeks but found nothing. And eventually, the case was marked unresolved. My hands shook as I realized the bracelet I found might belong to her. And the dream, that woman's voice, wasn't just my imagination. It was her, trying to reach out. That evening, I went back to the lake again, holding the bracelet tightly. The air was colder than usual, the sky heavy with clouds. I stood at the edge of the dock and whispered, "Clara, if you're here, please show me." For a moment, there was silence. Then the water rippled. Even though the air was completely still, a faint light began to shimmer beneath the surface. And then slowly, a figure emerged, faint, glowing, sad. She looked young, her eyes filled with sorrow. Her lips moved, but I couldn't hear her. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "I found your bracelet," I said softly. "Tell me what you want me to do." The light around her flickered, and suddenly, an image flashed in my mind. A dark shape, something heavy sinking into the water. A man's voice yelling, a struggle. And then silence. I gasped, stumbling backward. I didn't know if it was a vision, a memory, or something she was trying to show me. But one thing was clear. Clara hadn't just vanished. She had been silenced. The next few days were a blur. I kept thinking about what I'd seen. Should I tell someone? Would they even believe me? Who would believe a woman who claimed to see ghosts and visions by the lake? But I couldn't ignore it. If Clara's story was unfinished, then maybe that was why the lake still felt restless. Maybe Daniel wasn't the only soul trapped there. I decided to do my own research. I found out Clara had worked at a cafe in town. Her co-workers described her as bright, kind, and full of life. But one of them mentioned something that made my blood run cold. A man she had been seeing before she disappeared. Someone who used to hang around the lake with her. His name wasn't in the reports, but I recognized it. It was the same last name as one of the police officers who handled Daniel's case years ago. It all began to make sense. The lake wasn't cursed, it was hiding secrets. And somehow those secrets were connected. That night, I went to the lake again. I didn't know what I expected to find, but I knew I had to go. As I stood there, the wind picked up, the trees swayed, and the air grew thick with energy. I closed my eyes and whispered both their names. Daniel, Clara. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the surface of the water began to glow softly. Two faint shapes appearing side by side. I could feel their presence. Calm waiting. "I know what happened," I said quietly, "and I'll make sure the truth is known." The glow brightened, and for a second, I saw both of them smiling. Then the water stilled again, peaceful, quiet. I knew what I had to do next. The truth had been buried for years, but not anymore. The next morning, I went straight to the town police station. I showed them the bracelet, the reports, and everything I'd found. They listened, skeptical at first, but agreed to reopen Clara's case. Within days, divers returned to the lake. And what they found confirmed everything. Buried beneath years of silt and water, they recovered the remains of a car. Not Daniel's, but another one. Inside, they found evidence that told the rest of the story. Clara hadn't drowned. She'd been murdered. And the man responsible had ties to the same officer who handled Daniel's case. Justice, after all these years, had finally surfaced. When I returned to the lake that evening, the air was warm, peaceful. I sat on the dock, watching the sunset, and for the first time, the water looked calm. Truly calm. No whispers, no visions, just silence. A good kind of silence. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that both Daniel and Clara were finally free. That night, as I walked away from the lake, I felt something brush gently against my hand. When I looked down, there was a single white feather lying on the ground. I smiled, tears in my eyes. "Goodbye," I whispered. And for the first time in a long, long time, I knew the past had finally let go. When I finally got home that evening, I went straight to my room, closed the door, and let myself cry, not loud sobs, but the kind of silent tears that come from deep inside. The kind that leave you exhausted. I felt broken, like I had been living a life full of illusions. I kept asking myself, how did I not see it? How could I be so blind, so naive? I replayed every moment in my head, every conversation, every smile, every promise, and suddenly, everything made sense in a painful way. The times he canceled dates, the way he avoided introducing me to his family, his excuses about being busy. It was all right there, I just didn't want to see it. I thought love meant trusting someone blindly, but maybe love means seeing the truth even when it hurts. The next morning, I didn't go to work, I couldn't face people, couldn't pretend that I was okay. I just sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the world move on while I felt stuck, frozen in one moment. My phone kept buzzing with messages from my best friend. She wanted to come over, but I didn't want to talk, I didn't want to explain, I didn't want pity. Days passed like that, one after another, blending into each other. I would wake up, stare at the ceiling and go back to sleep. Sometimes I didn't eat. Sometimes I would just sit on the floor staring at the wall. I didn't recognize myself anymore. I had become a stranger to my own reflection. But slowly, something inside me began to change. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't dramatic, it was small, like the way dawn slowly replaces night. I started writing again, just simple thoughts at first, like, I miss who I used to be, or I wish I could forget him. But with every line, I felt lighter. I began to realize that my story didn't end with him. It just changed direction. A few weeks later, I decided to go out. I put on my favorite dress, not for anyone else, but for me. I went to the small cafe near the lake, the one we used to visit. It hurt a little to sit there alone, but I did it. I ordered my usual coffee and looked around. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel sad, I felt strong, because I was finally reclaiming the places that once belonged to my memories. Life started to move again, slowly but surely. I went back to work, started spending time with friends, even laughed again. Though it felt strange at first, one day, while scrolling through my phone, I saw a message from him, just a simple, "Hey, can we talk?" I stared at it for a long time, my heart didn't race like before, I didn't feel that ache in my chest anymore, I just felt calm. I typed no. And hit send, no explanation, no anger, just a word that meant freedom. It felt like closing a chapter that had already ended long ago. Months later, something beautiful happened. I got a job offer in another city. It was something I had always wanted but never pursued because I was too afraid to leave, afraid to start over. But this time, I said yes. I packed my bags, said goodbye to my old apartment, and took a train to a new beginning. That city felt like fresh air, new streets, new faces, new possibilities. I found a small apartment with a view of the park. I started decorating it the way I liked. Plants, candles, books, soft lights. It became my little sanctuary, a space that reflected who I was becoming. Not who I used to be. I remember one rainy evening, sitting by the window, watching the raindrops race down the glass, and realizing I wasn't sad anymore. I was grateful for everything that broke me because it also rebuilt me. I had become someone stronger, calmer, and more honest with myself. One day, while walking through the park, I met someone new. He wasn't like him, he didn't try too hard, he didn't make grand promises. He just listened genuinely. He asked about my dreams, not my past. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to hide anything. I didn't rush it. I just let things be. One moment at a time. We would meet often, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for quiet walks. He didn't try to fill my silence. And I appreciated that because for the first time, I realized that love doesn't have to be loud to be real. It can be gentle, steady, and peaceful. But more than that, I learned that I didn't need love to complete me. I was already whole. And that realization was the most powerful thing of all. Now when I look back, I don't see pain anymore. I see growth. I see a girl who once thought she couldn't live without someone, and a woman who learned she could. I see every mistake as a lesson, every heartbreak as a step toward becoming who I was meant to be. Sometimes I still think about him, not with anger, not with longing, but with a quiet acceptance. He was a chapter, not my whole book, and maybe that's what life is, a collection of chapters, some beautiful, some painful, but all necessary. I once believed that losing him was the worst thing that could happen, but now I know, losing myself for someone who never valued me was the real tragedy. Finding myself again was the miracle. Every scar I carry reminds me that I survived, that I was brave enough to walk through fire and come out shining. Not perfect, not untouched, but stronger, wiser, softer. So if you're listening to this, and you're going through something similar, I want you to know this. It will pass, the pain, the confusion, the loneliness, it will fade. One day you'll wake up, and the heaviness will be gone, replaced by peace. You'll laugh again, you'll trust again, you'll love again, but this time, it will start with you. Because once you learn to love yourself, the right people find their way to you. Not because they complete you, but because they respect your completeness. I'm not saying life will always be easy, it won't. There will still be days when I miss the past, or doubt the future, but now I have something I didn't have before. Faith in myself, faith in the process, and faith that every ending is just a new beginning in disguise. Sometimes at night, I still look at the stars and whisper a quiet thank you. Not for what I lost, but for what I found. Me, the version of myself that I had forgotten while loving someone else. And maybe, that's the real happy ending, not finding someone to hold your hand, but finding the strength to hold your own. Because this is my story, my pain, my healing, my growth, and my peace. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. Not even the love I once thought I couldn't live without. It's strange how time changes everything. How the same places that once held pain can start to feel peaceful again. It's been almost a year since that night when my world fell apart. And now, when I look back, I don't see tragedy anymore. I see transformation. I see the moment I stopped living for someone else and started living for myself. When I first moved to this new city, I thought it would just be an escape, a way to run from memories, but it became so much more than that. It became a rebirth, a quiet rediscovery of who I was without anyone else's shadow over me. I began to notice small joys, like the smell of coffee in the morning, or the way sunlight filled my room. Things I had ignored before because I was too busy chasing love. I joined a writing group at a local bookstore. It wasn't planned, I just saw the poster one evening while walking by, and something inside me said, go. I was nervous at first, sitting among strangers, listening to their stories, but when it was my turn to speak, I started reading a piece I had written about heartbreak. My hands trembled, my voice cracked, but as I continued, the words flowed, raw and real. And when I finished, there was silence, then gentle applause. That moment changed everything. I realized that pain, when shared, loses its power to destroy you. It becomes art. It becomes healing. After that, I started writing every day, not for anyone else, but for me. It became my therapy, my truth, my mirror. Sometimes I'd walk by the river after work, sit on the bench, and watch people pass by, couples holding hands, families laughing, and I'd smile, not because I missed it, but because I understood it now. Love wasn't about losing yourself. It was about finding someone who reminds you of your worth. And I promised myself that if love ever found me again, I'd never forget who I am. One evening, I was sitting at my favorite cafe, writing in my notebook. When a man approached me, he looked familiar. It took me a second to realize he was the same person I had met in the park months ago. We exchanged smiles. He asked if he could sit. I nodded. We talked for hours, not about our pasts, but about everything else. Books, movies, travel, dreams, life. He had a calm energy, the kind that didn't demand attention but still held it naturally. We started meeting often after that, but there was no rush, no pressure, no labels, just connection. It felt safe. It felt kind. He respected my space, my silence, and that meant more to me than any grand gesture ever could. I didn't know where it would lead, and for the first time, I was okay with not knowing. I had learned to live in the moment, to let life unfold without trying to control every chapter. One night, I told him everything, about my past, the heartbreak, the betrayal, the pain. I expected him to pull away, to see me differently, but he didn't. He just listened quietly and said, I'm glad you survived it. That simple sentence hit me harder than any declaration of love ever could, because it wasn't pity, it was respect. Months passed, and our bond grew stronger, not because we needed each other to be whole, but because we appreciated each other's wholeness. We supported each other's dreams, encouraged each other to grow. It was love, but it was built on friendship, trust, and peace, the kind of love that doesn't drain you, it fills you. And yet, even with him in my life, I never forgot my promise to myself. I kept writing, kept learning, kept traveling. I wanted to build a life that was full on its own, with or without anyone, and I did. I finally felt free. A year later, I published my first book. It wasn't about romance or heartbreak. It was about resilience, about how sometimes life has to break you to rebuild you, about the beauty of starting over. I remember holding the first printed copy in my hands, my name on the cover, my words inside. It felt surreal, like holding a piece of my soul. My parents called that day. Their voices full of pride. My mother said, "You've come so far," and I smiled because she was right. I had come far, not in distance but in spirit. I wasn't the same girl who once cried herself to sleep over someone who couldn't see her worth. I had become a woman who didn't need validation to know her value. Later that night, I stood on my balcony, the city lights glittering below, and I thought about how life had changed, how pain had turned into purpose, how loss had turned into strength, and how endings had turned into beginnings. Sometimes I still receive messages from people who read my book. They say things like, "Your story helped me heal," or, "I thought I was alone until I read your words." And every time, I cry a little, because that's when I know everything I went through wasn't for nothing. It had meaning. It became light for someone else's darkness. I've learned that healing isn't a straight line. Some days you'll feel strong, and other days you'll break again. But each time you do, you rise a little higher, you understand a little more, you forgive a little deeper, and that's what makes you human. One day, while cleaning my apartment, I found an old photo of him tucked inside a book. For a moment, I just stared at it. The girl in that picture wasn't me anymore. She was someone who needed love to feel worthy. I smiled softly, folded the photo, and placed it in a box, not out of anger, but closure. As I sat down, I realized that life never really goes the way we plan. Sometimes it gives us heartbreaks to teach us strength. Sometimes it takes people away to make room for better ones. And sometimes, it shatters us completely, just so we can rebuild into someone stronger, someone wiser, someone freer. That night, my new partner and I went for a walk under the stars. He looked at me and said, "You seem peaceful." And I smiled because I was not because everything was perfect, but because I had stopped fighting what I couldn't control. I had learned to flow with life, to trust it, to believe that whatever is meant for me will find me. When we reached the end of the street, he held my hand gently, and in that quiet moment, I realized something. Love doesn't always come when you're searching for it. It comes when you finally learn to love yourself, when your heart is no longer desperate, but open. I looked up at the sky, the stars shining like old friends, and whispered a small thank you. To the pain that taught me, to the past that shaped me, to the love that found me again, but most of all, to myself, for never giving up. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that every ending carries the seed of a new beginning, and every heartbreak carries the lesson your soul needs to grow. So here I am now, telling my story, not as a victim, but as a survivor, as someone who found beauty in brokenness, strength in solitude, and peace in acceptance. And maybe that's what life is really about. Not avoiding pain, but embracing it, learning from it, letting it mold you into someone softer, kinder, stronger. If I could go back and tell that heartbroken girl one thing, I'd tell her, one day, you'll thank the person who broke you, because they unknowingly set you free. Free to dream again, to love again, to live again. And this time I'm living. Not for someone else, not for validation, not for fear of being alone, but for me, for the woman who rose from her own ashes and built a life she loves. Because this is my story, my truth, my journey, and it's far from over. Every day, I'm still writing it. One breath, one choice, one heartbeat at a time. And if my story can help even one person believe that they too can start over, then every tear, every sleepless night, every broken piece, was worth it. Because healing isn't about forgetting the past, it's about forgiving it. And moving forward, gracefully, courageously, beautifully. So this is me, not perfect, not unscarred, but real. And that I've learned is more than enough.